We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest to our interview series, Allison Crawford. She is the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Ripple. Allison, how are you doing over there in San Francisco?
So far, so good. Yeah, happy Monday.
Happy Monday. Thanks so much for being with us. If you could start off by sharing a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns and what in the world has recently brought you joy.
Oh gosh. Well, I'll go with the easier one. My preferred pronouns are she or hers, just like yours. And I'm based here in San Francisco. I'm the global head of diversity and inclusion at Ripple. And before Ripple, I joined Ripple about a year ago. And before that, I was at Uber for 4 years. Before that, I was at Yelp, the local search. It was a site when I joined it. Now it's more known as an app. So that's how long ago I was at Yelp. And something that brings me joy these days, well, a couple of things. I have actually our first diversity and inclusion hire starting today. Today's his first day. So I'm going to have to give him a shout out. I know this is going to be recorded, but Colin Jones, welcome to the team. Very exciting. Excited to have him join. And then another, I just revisited Beyonce's Homecoming special.
Oh, amazing.
Netflix. It's just like a gift that keeps on giving. I mean, it's now a few years old, but in my mind, it's timeless. So that's my pump me up music.
Amazing. I love that. Someone just asked me what your pump up song is. And I was like, J-Lo's like, let's get loud. So I love that answer.
That's a great one too. Okay, we have to create a playlist.
I would definitely be down for that. You mentioned that you worked at like larger tech companies like Uber and Yelp, and you have a lot of experience in like D&I as well. How do you think your like personal journey has really led you to lead the team here at Ripple?
Yeah, so I actually started out as individual contributor within sales. I worked in sales for a number of years and then went into sales management. So I've always been doing a lot of convincing and selling in my role. And that's actually translated really well into diversity and inclusion. And when you're a sales leader, you also do a lot of trainings and you're up in front of people, convincing them to do something or having them expand knowledge in a specific area. And that really has transitioned well into my current role. About 5 or 6 years ago, I started doing a lot more work within employee resource group work with empowering women, people of color, parents, LGBTQ community. And really what that did was kind of open my eyes to the opportunities specifically within tech, because we know that it's an industry that needs a lot of work when it comes to representation. So when I went to Uber, it was very clear to me that there was a pretty big opportunity. And after the Susan Fowler blog post came out in 2017, there was a big need for a cultural shift within Uber. So I started taking on more and more work in the ERG space. And then that BD sales knowledge then transferred to managing our partnerships and community. So taking a look at where we're spending money, how that's making impact outside of the organization, but at the same time, really building our communities within our employee base, which was 29,000 folks by the time I left globally.
Wow. It's crazy. And I know you mentioned too, for D&I and especially employee resource groups, there can be so many goals in terms of internal engagement and external engagement for community involvement. Can you tell us a little bit more about Ripple's specific diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy and what the goals are and what it entails?
Oh, yes. So we divide it right down the middle, like you said, internal and external. And when we look at internal strategy, it's really about attracting, retaining, and developing all Ripplers, but especially folks that have diverse backgrounds. And we do that by partnering with all of our different people functions, whether it be leadership and development, recruiting, taking a look at our hiring process as it relates to also when it dovetails into career advancement and promotions. And then when we take a look at externally, we have some fantastic partnerships with specific universities to ensure that we're developing that talent for folks that are starting out their career and if they're interested in blockchain technology as well too.
Okay, great. No, I think it's really important to be super specific around those goals. And I think that it sounds like Ripple's doing a lot in terms of internally with current employees and then externally as well. Diving in a little bit deeper to last summer, how did Ripple really respond to the anti-racism movement we really saw after George Floyd's murder in June?
Mhm. So, Christina, it was crazy timing because I joined Ripple May 11th. I just celebrated my 1 year last month.
Congrats.
And thanks. And then George Floyd his life was taken from him on May 25th.
Mhm.
So before joining Ripple, we did not have any, D&I strategy. There wasn't a individual, dedicated to D&I work. So my job became very relevant very quickly. And I was just blown away by the acceptance from not only our CEO, but all of his direct reports and leaders in general, with really finding our voice within the organization. So it still felt genuine and not so much reactionary. And how are we going to set up actual programming that continue to grow and scale with our organization? So we did a number of initiatives, both internal and external. The biggest one was actually we launched 7 employee resource groups on September 3rd. So just after a couple months, we hadn't had any groups before. So that was fantastic. We also committed ourselves to the board challenge, which is committing ourselves to adding one person that self-identifies as Black African American to our board by the end of this year. We also really ramped up our recruiting processes. So we implemented the Rooney Rule. We started tracking our pipeline data to ensure that we were getting not only a diverse set of candidates, but really taking a stronger look at what that candidate experience looks like. Who are they speaking to? What's the feedback that we need to implement so we can actually grow an inclusive organization, not just a diverse one?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I just try to do this too with our conversations. For those who aren't familiar with the Rooney Rule, what is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so the Rooney Rule actually came from, believe it or not, the NFL. And that was I always caveat that. I'm like, can you believe it? And it was to build diverse representation within, I believe, their coaching strategy. And what it does is it ensures that there's at least one diverse candidate on any, there's a couple ways to do it. You want to make sure there's at least 1 or 2 diverse candidates within the interview process if you're considering a role. For us, what we did was it was actually important that we had diverse representation with manager and above. So anyone that's in a people leadership position, we wanted to see higher representation of people of color. So we actually require not 1, but 2 candidates, diverse candidates for leadership positions. And it's been really fantastic to see that implemented and then also increased representation within our leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And measuring representation in leadership, in the recruitment pipeline, in promotions, in pay equity is part of that like puzzle as well. And then we always want to talk about just the other kind of indicators of success as you're building out these employee resource groups. You said you launched a couple in September. There's obviously that is like a marker of success. But when you're thinking about programming in like an intangible feeling like you belong at a company, how do you really think about those different initiatives and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. A great question. And, employee resource groups, I think that we need to be representing them in a much stronger way. I think sometimes they might get pushed aside or kind of seen as interest groups, but really they're the eyes and the ears of the organization. That's what really develops the culture of an organization. So I implement this fantastic model. I'll give a big shout out to Dr. Robert Rodriguez, and you can go ahead and just Google him right now. I've had the pleasure of working with him over the last few years. He has a new book coming out, and he developed what we call the 4C model. So everyone I'll give you a minute. You can get your pen down because I'm going to go over each one very briefly. The 4 C's are culture, careers, community, and commerce. And every employee resource group can really follow that model. If you are a company that has 50 people or like Uber, 29,000 folks by the time I left, it's a way to ensure that ERG programming really ties to the business and impacts culture in a positive way to build a more inclusive organization.
I love that. And that's easy to remember as well in terms of
You
just
would
the
be
goalposts.
surprised. You'd be surprised. Sometimes I get stuck on one. And even though I've been preaching it for years now, I'm like, okay, I already said culture. I'm like, I have to have extra coffee before I go launch into that.
No, I love that. I love that. And we'll kind of link that resource in the show notes too, just so folks can check it out. I know as a DEI practitioner, sometimes I'm sure people come in with these preconceived notions around what diversity, equity, and inclusion is and is not. I would love to ask like what mistakes you've seen individuals or companies make when engaging in this work on a larger scale, not just at Ripple in your experience. For example, I hear all the time that, you know, what you said in terms of size of companies, that we're a startup or we're only 10 people. We can't think about that until we're like a couple hundred people, which we know it should be fed in the process right away. Like, what are your kind of thoughts around what you're seeing in the market today?
Yeah. So I think sometimes, folks will make shortcuts or assumptions around what this programming looks like. A lot of the times it'll be around recruiting and solely recruiting. So like, okay, what we have to do is increase our numbers. We know that we have X% representation around this identity. How can we get more? But the thing is, it's actually not that hard. And this is from one of our HR leaders at Uber, Leanne Hornsey, said, it's actually not that hard to build a diverse organization, but it's very hard to build an inclusive organization. And when we think of inclusive actions, really that has to come from leadership. How are they interacting with people that have identities that are different than their own? Are they seeing those differences as strengths versus weaknesses, and really building an inclusive workforce from there? And, so not making those shortcuts. And then I think your question was around like kind of common mistakes or assumptions. I'm trying to think of anything else. I think sometimes we have a tendency to be like, okay, this D&I person has to sit within this part of the organization, or they have to be reporting to so-and-so. But in my experience, it's really about how you're developing your relationship with the executive leadership team. Are you being asked to speak at their offsites? Are you, incorporating your work within the leadership and development team? Are you incorporating your work with the recruiting team? And that's why I love Ripple so much. Is I'm a team. I was a one woman show up until today. So Colin joined me, but I never felt like I was alone, because I had all these senior leaders from the day I started asking, how can I help you be successful here? And I encourage, folks that are in my role to really take advantage of that. And I always say, I'm like, careful what you ask for, because I'm coming after you. Like, how do you want to partner? I'm like, I already have 2 ideas. Yeah. And one next month. So they're like, oh, okay. So I always say careful what you wish for.
Yeah, I love that. Do you think the role of managers and how we define effective leadership has changed over the past year?
How we define manager, I think we have to take a stronger look at kind of how many years of management style are these people leaders having, and what kind of function or role. Or now we have this kind of huge hurdle around what does the workplace look like and feel like?
Yes.
Because we now are going to go back to a workplace. Are we going back? I don't know. Some people are, some people aren't. But there's the concept that I often speak about. It's actually called the boss lottery. And you never want to feel like you lost the boss lottery. And we all know what that means, right out of the gate. It's like, oh, well, my boss lets me do X, Y, and Z. Like, my boss doesn't let me do any of that. And it can be kind of shallow actions, like maybe smaller actions, like letting you work from home or whatnot. But then it's like when big life events happen, like if you welcome a new child, you want to win the boss lottery, because that can really set back your career. So how do you remove that element to build an inclusive culture? That's really what a ton of, I think, DEI work should be based around, kind of moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't heard the term boss lottery, but when you mentioned it, I was just like, yeah, that's definitely something that exists out there.
You win big, you lose big. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely lucky that I've won big like many times, and grateful for that. And another part of an inclusive environment as well, in addition to managers, employee resource groups, programming, events, is benefits. And you mentioned that this is one of the areas that you're passionate about too, in terms of benefits equity. What are kind of unique benefits that Ripple offers, and what really led you to get into kind of this topic that's kind of, kind of niche and like specific into the realm of equity?
Yeah, great question. So I think, taking many steps back, I can't even believe this, but I had my daughter, next week it'll be 8 years ago. She turns 8.
Oh,
I just,
Gemini.
time flies. And when we welcomed her into the family, we were living abroad, and at the time, the benefits actually did not translate to the office that I was based in. So if I had had her when I was living in San Francisco, I would have had a different amount of paid time off than if I was living in London. And that was not, yeah, it was interesting. I have a different word for it, but I won't use it in this recording. A couple of words for it, actually.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It was a learning experience, but I vowed from that day forward, June 18th, 2013, that anyone that was working with me would not have that same experience. If you worked for a company, you would get this many days off. And then most importantly, if you worked for a company and you welcomed a child into your home, it didn't matter if you gave birth or not. Every parent should get the same amount of time off. There's already a huge divide when we see the role that women play within a family, house life, domestic labor, emotional labor. Let's start by evening it out by giving the equal amount of time off from a parental leave perspective. So we implemented equal leave at Uber, and then we also implemented equal leave at Ripple. And what that means is everyone gets 16 weeks, and it doesn't matter what office you sit in. And we're starting to see that more and more be the norm. I'm hoping and praying, but that's within tech. Only 14% of people in the US actually have any type of paid leave. 14%. We're way behind. So it's something that I'm passionate about and giving back. So I worked with paidleave.us for a number of years as well too. And then to answer your question, mental health has also been a huge piece of our benefits offering, and worked over the years both with Lyra and Modern Health. Also, Clio is focused on parental benefits, but also within that mental health piece as well too. We need to make sure that people are taking care of themselves from a psychological standpoint, especially these days, because there's been a lot on our plates.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on that mental health piece and just knowing that employees like find solace and just recharge in different ways too. How do you really prioritize the team's kind of mental health using the resources or organizations that you mentioned?
Yeah, so we make sure that those communications are really strong. They're coming from the right people, multiple touch points, through email and Slack. But then also Ripple has offered R&R days. And I kind of pause and smile because people go crazy for these R&R days. It's 2 or 3 a quarter, and they're usually on a Friday or a Monday. Sometimes I think it might be midweek. I have to reflect and see, but in our engagement survey, people have gone crazy for these R&R days. And Christina, we offer unlimited PTO. So I'm like, just take off if you want to take off. And I'm kind of dreading the day that we might sunset those. I don't know. I hope no one comes after me for even saying that, but they can't, last forever. But people really love them to take that extra time to do really whatever they want and just kind of recharge. So that's been really meaningful.
I love that. And I think it's interesting too that you mentioned that Ripple does offer PTO, but having those designated days where everybody has off and you're just like, you are not the only, is just really interesting from a psychological perspective as well.
Yeah. I guess everyone else is off. That's why they're extra restful. But I'm like, we have unlimited PTO. You can take off as much as you want. And if everyone's offline, I think it makes a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you kind of think about preventively preventing just like the burnout in general amongst teams too? I think that's definitely related to mental health, and just especially now as folks are working from home and there's not necessarily a clear line of separation between personal and professional life.
Yeah, I think we've done a great job when it comes to managing calendars. We implement a lot of the features within Google Calendar where you can actually block out specific times where it just automatically declines. So we have a strong presence internationally as well too. So we want to be mindful of their bandwidth and ensure they're not taking calls in the middle of the night. So really implementing that and being respectful. One of the things I noticed about Ripple is like when I first joined, we have a culture where people just send me a Slack being like, can I put some time in your calendar? I'm like, sure, like you can just go ahead, like send it over. And people are they're just very mindful, and they respect time blocks. I see countless time blocks for things like lunch, taking a walk, taking your children to school. So I think that, and then we've implemented a lot of programming that's actually really fun that we've embraced over Zoom. So we've hosted a lot of like bingo, karaoke, trivia, happy hours, cooking classes, all these things that if you told me a couple of years ago, I'd be like, I don't think people will dial in for that. But but it's really nice to get to know employees virtually. Since I started, right at the beginning of the pandemic, it's been great to kind of have that downtime to get to know people on a personal level.
Yeah, and these are all opportunities to get to know people on that personal level, whether you're at the cooking class, you're at the virtual yoga class, or you're having a one-on-one like virtual coffee chat with someone too.
Yes.
And I think that definitely manifests in the rest of the organization and your day-to-day as well. How do you see that culture of employee listening on your end, especially as a leader, really manifesting in the business of the organization as well? Why is it so important?
All right, I'll have to pause. So can you repeat the question just one more time?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Why do you think it's so important to build trust amongst employees and really listen to feedback?
Okay. So when we take a look at building trust and inclusion, it's really important to, I think, learn from those key moments. And I'll give you an example. We have our weekly company all hands, and there's an opportunity to ask questions. And we saw this trend happen with a number of other companies. We're not that special, but the type of questions that we see that are posted under the anonymous tag and the type of questions that we see if someone's name is attached to them really can be different, and they can look and feel different. And we saw this at Uber as well too. And we decided to go away from anonymous questions, and we saw that there was actually a rise in kind of questions that felt more productive. And I think that leads to building trust within the organization when you start to see people really take accountability for how they provide feedback and when they speak up. And then that will start to look and feel different when we go back into the office, right? Because back before, it would be you'd walk up to the mic in front of everyone and you just say something. So how do we, kind of translate that over time from being virtual to being in person, but staying true to our culture? And like you said, the most important thing is building trust with the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to have feedback that is really constructive as well, and just make space for employees to give it to, no matter where they are in the world. Kind of going back to a more like bigger picture of the DEI industry, is there something you're seeing kind of in your work, whether it's, with companies or individuals, a trend that people need to be aware of in order to be successful in the future?
Oh, yes. I would say I cannot get past this question without celebrating the big announcement from LinkedIn last week around paying their employee resource group.
I love that.
So good. I had a pleasure working with Natalie Morales, who spearheaded that. Shout out to her last year. It was one of my favorite projects I implemented at Uber. We've been paying our employee resource group leads there since actually 2017, which is really exciting. But it'll be great to see that implemented at Ripple as well too. All of my employee resource group leads sent me that article that day, and I'm like, okay, don't worry, you're getting paid, okay? Calm down. But they're like, this is cool. I'm like, yeah, I know it's cool. Don't worry, I got you. But I think that should be the norm, and that's a trend that we're going to see more and more. But it's all about tracking. It's all about ensuring that the work that they're doing is tied to business initiatives, and that going back to that 4C model I mentioned earlier, that's how you do it. And that's what I've seen kind of the biggest levels of success within any size of organization.
I love that you highlighted that. When I saw that article, especially as a former employee resource group leader, it's definitely a full-time job. And when you are contributing to the business in that way, I think it's a great recognition of that as well. Is there any characteristics of coworkers in general that you really value in the folks that you work with as well that you want to highlight?
Yes, definitely. I always go back to one of my favorite books, The Four Agreements. I don't know if you ever read it, but
Haven't.
okay, well, now you
Now
know.
I can.
Add it to the list. The Four Agreements, it goes to this concept of really, walk over the four of them. You can write them down if you want.
Yes.
Being impeccable with your word, being really mindful of what you say and how it affects others. And that could be right then in that moment. It could be 10 years from now, but really paying attention and taking a step back, not being reactionary. Don't take anything personally. That's another one. I think sometimes we have a tendency to take things personally. We just had a situation this morning where a calendar invite went out and we forgot to include some folks on that calendar invite or about some details. And they did a great job. They didn't take it personally. Like, all right, it was just a mistake, like it was a communications mistake. Those things happen. But that's how we got past it. And again, going back to building trust. The other ones are not making assumptions and doing your best. So not assume positive intent, which is one of my favorite things to say.
Yeah.
And then anything you're going to do that day, do the best job at it, which sounds not that hard, but it's actually really difficult. So if I'm going to do this workout, I'm doing this workout. If I'm going to give this presentation, I'm going to give this presentation. I'm going to give it, a 10 out of 10, which isn't feasible, every single day, but at least being aware of that, I think is really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way to summarize it too, in terms of showing up and being present and giving it your all, and also showing yourself and others grace is really important as well. I think a lot of people would look at your career path and just, the global head of D&I at this awesome company, like everything is perfect, I'm sure. What is like,
Christina, no, not perfect. Yeah.
what would you want to share with folks about like the hardest part of your job?
Yeah. And actually, when I reviewed that question, when you sent it over, I'm like, nothing's hard. I just like went into this like defensive mode, I'm like, I don't struggle with anything. Everything's great. Like you said, it's perfect. But I would say, I often talk about, here I am again, listing things out, the 3 different types of empathy. So the 3 different types of empathy, there's one of them that's actually called compassionate empathy. And when that's the type of empathy that when you hear about something, you can actually feel it and it might stick with you for longer than you think. And there was actually a study done with some psychologists where they found that if they were working with a patient and that person suffered from really severe depression, if they saw that patient at the end of their day, they would actually kind of take those feelings home with them, and it would carry them into their night routine, maybe with their family, maybe with themselves emotionally, and really kind of distancing themselves was the hardest piece when they were working with someone that was severely depressed. The other types, cognitive and emotional empathy, those are the times that you see right out of the gate that someone's really upset, and then you want to fix it, but you can't. It can be really frustrating. So I always reflect about those 3 different types of empathy and try to be aware of my emotions and what I'm taking home with me, because I'm in my home. Okay. So it's not even, it's just here. I'm at, my table.
Yes.
And how am I separating that if I'm having a, really tough day, and making sure that it's productive for myself and being protective of my time and my emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't say that enough. Being productive of your time and your emotions, especially in this work, it could be deeply personal too. And just wanting to help as many people as you can. It's just a lot on your shoulders. How do you recharge after work or use your R&R days?
Oh, my R&R days. I've really stuck to making sure that I get outside and exercise at least like 15 minutes. Sometimes it's 15, sometimes it's 30, sometimes it's an hour, but staying active. I grew up an athlete, so it's always been part of kind of my, I don't want to say my lifestyle because that sounds kind of pompous, but it's like, it's always been part of, I don't know, who I am is to be active. I do miss like classes in person, like a yoga class in the studio, but I miss that social aspect. But staying active. I also love to cook, and I've tried to embrace, I go through waves where I can't stand it. And then I'm like, oh, I can't wait to look at these new recipes. So I'm like, so kind of finding balance there. But then, my favorite way to spend any time is obviously with my family. So I've been married for over a decade, which I'm really proud of. That's hard work.
Yes.
Hard work.
I can only imagine.
Kept my daughter alive for 8 years. So those are my two kind of real joys. It's my family.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And it sounds like you definitely have ways to just spend joy and just recharge after work, which is really, really important. I know we've ranged the gamut on what we've talked about from your personal experience to Ripple's diversity, equity, inclusion strategy and kind of the thought process there. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to kind of highlight in our conversation, or a key takeaway you wanted to emphasize for our listeners as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, reflecting over the last year plus, I don't know, is it 18 months? What are we calling this timeline? I say a year. I say 2020 because it just feels right. I need a round number. But when you reflect on 2020, there's going to be a lot of things that you had to edit out of your life and really suddenly. And there were a lot of things that you had to bring into your life really suddenly. What are the things that you want to keep with you? And what do you want to keep in 2020? So there might have been new habits, or there might have been new rituals. What do you want to keep and what do you want to leave behind? What have you learned? And I've been trying to work at that, which is easier said than done. We mentioned just before this call that I am now getting invited to every birthday party and happy hour. And I just want to be able to say no sometimes. I'm gonna take that with me and just say, like, I would rather just stay home and read or play, a game. So I think reflecting on that, what are we keeping and what are we leaving behind? That's what I encourage others to reflect on as well too.
What a call to action. What are we keeping and what are we leaving behind? The good questions, the big questions, but also I think the reflection piece of that is super important too. And having healthy boundaries, I think is really important.
Yes, easier said than done, but still important.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture, Allison, and just talking about kind of your philosophy and how you got to where you are.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, AllVoices believes in the empowerment of everyone to speak up at an organization and thinks it's a requirement in order for the company to succeed. And we'll speak soon.